The CS role is a constantly developing one in general practice, and one that's definitely hit how people are working in the 2025 and in particular as we move into 2026. In this episode, I'm joined by three amazing people. Some you've seen before, some that are new, but we're going to talk about the clinical safety officer role in general practice and healthcare and how this is going to change things for you and what you need to know about it as we continue to tech enhance your primary care and learning. Hello, eGP learners, and welcome to this episode where I'm joined again by Dr. Keith Grimes, Yusuf, and Dean Mawson talking about the concept of the CSO, Clinical Safety Officer role in healthcare, and in particular, I guess, with general practice. And we're going to cover all the questions you've asked us and a lot more in terms of this role for you. But before we do that, it'd be useful if we introduce everyone. So, Yusuf, do you want to kick us off and say hi to everyone?
Hi, everyone. I'm Yusuf. I'm a public health medicine consultant, and I'm a clinical safety officer and head of data and safety at Curistica.
Awesome. And we've also got Keith joining us again on the channel. How are we doing there, Keith? You're on mute, Keith. Rookie boy mistake.
There you go. First risk. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, thank goodness. All right. Okay. Hello. My name is Keith. I'm a former GP. I don't practice anymore, but remain GMC licensed. And I'm the founder of Curistica. We are an innovation consultancy that help with clinical safety, data protection, and general AI stuff. If you're building it or deploying it, we help out.
Awesome. And joining us as well this time, we've got Dean joining us. How are we there?
Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Dean. I am the founder and clinical director of DPM Digital Health. We are a regulatory compliance consultancy as well, and nurse by background, 34 years. Only stopped practicing in 2020. And we also train clinical safety officers.
Awesome. So this session came out of what's on some of the ongoing stuff that we're seeing across healthcare, general practice, and various other parts of the health system itself in terms of this role of the clinical safety officer. So we're going to go through a few key parts about what that means, what it involves, and hopefully giving you a good snapshot of everything you need to know potentially to get started as a CSO, or even better, function as a CSO in healthcare. So I think probably the best place to start, though, is what is a CSO? Who wants to take that one?
Oh, this is why we arranged it all beforehand. We're going to hand over to Dean. We're going to defer to Dean because Dean has been the CSO for the longest time here.
All right.
No pressure, Keith. Okay, so a clinical safety officer. So CSO is a clinical safety officer. So in the realms of, we're going to talk a little bit because I need to give context here. So in digital health, there are two standards. So there's DCB 0129, DCB 160. So those standards are in relation to regulatory compliance of digital health systems, in relation to the reduction of risk of harm, in relation to identified hazards, to the patient in the enablement of digital health technologies. So those standards, they have evolved over the years. They came out in their first format in 2009. Okay, they were mandated in 2012 under the Health and Social Care Act. And it clearly states in section 2 of those standards that a top management responsibility is that you appoint a clinical safety officer. So a clinical safety officer needs to be a professionally registered clinician, okay, that is practicing, has experience, okay, within the sector of digital health, and their responsibilities in respect to they have to have undertaken approved training in clinical risk management, okay, as a CSO practitioner, and they are responsible for undertaking the clinical risk management activities in line with the standards, and we'll come on to talk sort of like a bit more about that in relation to the wheres and what fors. So that's it in a nutshell.
Awesome. Can I just butt in with a quick question then? Because this is one of the most commonly asked ones I get from a variety of the formats. So can a practice manager become a CSO?
Right. Okay. Good question. So let's, and this is something that we've covered just recently, actually, on courses that we've delivered. So those people that can be a CSO, if I start there, so you have to hold a professional registration, and what that means, okay, is that is a professional register, not a voluntary register, as a clinician. Okay, so we're looking at NMC, GMC, as opposed to, and I use this example within our training. So the example of if you're a nutritionist as opposed to a dietitian, okay, so a nutritionist has a voluntary register that they can register on. Okay, they're not autonomous and they're not accountable in relation to their actions. Okay, so they will report back to, okay, and hand over to a dietitian. Okay, this is just appear as an example, and a dietitian holds a professional registration. Okay, and they are the decision makers, they are autonomous and they are accountable. So it has to be a professional registration where you are accountable for your actions.
Okay, and just to confirm then, does that registration have to be an active registration? Or
it does, yes. Yeah. It has to be an active registration. You can't have, if you've let your registration lapse, then unfortunately you can't act as a clinical safety officer.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe we can come in there as well. This is not to presuppose that a practice manager isn't also one of those things as well. I'd say that was much less common.
Yes.
But if you had a practice manager that also had that, then I suppose they could fit in. But then where they'd fit in the time to be a CSO as well will be tricky, I suppose.
Definitely. And I guess the reason that comes up is often I think practice managers are one of those roles within the practice that tend to know a lot more about how the systems or the software may impact, particularly the business functions and the operational aspects of practices. And I guess that's one of the ones I've had constantly asked to me. And yeah, just wanted to have that clarity, I think, for the everyone out there and stuff, because it's a frequent one that's there.
But Dean, I'm sure you'd agree that the practice managers have an absolutely critical role in the clinical risk management of the, they're not going to be left out here.
Oh, absolutely. And, one of the points we'd like to make in relation to, we're going to come on to sort of like talk about this a lot more, is that the role of the clinical safety officer can feel, especially in my experience over sort of like been doing this now for sort of 18 years, can be quite a lonely role, or feel like a lonely role for some people. And there's probably lots of people that can relate to that out there. But this is definitely a team effort. And where you've already alluded to in relation to the practice manager and the experience that they are an absolute essential part of the team within sort of like primary care in relation to contributing to the clinical risk management process, and the sort of outputs in relation to that.
Okay, so I guess next question then, and in I guess kind of that highlight kind of feature, what exactly is the role? So what this year, so what are their actual responsibilities when it comes to practice role, NHS, etc., and that kind of thing?
Is that over to me as well, or
looks that way?
Okay, all right, okay. So the role of the CSO. So there are a number of things in relation to that. So the ask of the standards is in relation that you undertake a formal risk assessment, okay, of any digital health system. Okay. So what that means is that there are a number of principles and methodologies that you will use. So there are risk analysis techniques, hazard identification techniques in identifying hazards in relation to that. So they will be instrumental in relation to that. But ultimately, there is sort of safety artifacts that are produced. So there's a clinical risk management plan, which should come at the start of a project, a hazard log, where you document all of your hazards, your mitigations, your risk ratings, etc. So you go through the risk assessment process. And there's an overarching clinical safety case report, which summarises the safety case and the reasoned safety argument in relation to your application of clinical risk management. So the role of the clinical safety officer is to oversee and make sure that those clinical risk management activities do take place and are applied in relation to the clinical risk management plan. and that's really key in relation to this, because your plan, it lays out all of the activities, the proposed activities, the resourcing of in relation to that digital health system. They are there to approve the safety documentation and the safety artifacts in relation to that. They have responsibilities to top management, so to make sure that they escalate any potential issues in relation to that. And they are the custodian, I would say, in relation to making sure that the digital health system is deployed safely in relation to that role.
The reason I deferred to Dean on this one is that Yusuf and I spent the last 2 days having our refresher course as a good professional development with Dean. So we know that Dean is going to have chapter and verse on this.
Well, one thing I would add to that as well is, and Dean's right, the CSO, the CSO doesn't have to do all of it themselves. I think this is a really key thing. The tasks and the activities can be delegated to someone else who is suitably experienced and is able to do it. And the CSO just has to be able to review and authorize the final version of whatever document that is, hazard log, CRMP, CRMS, whatever that may be. So I think that's quite important, because I think often CSOs, and we'll get into some of the myths and some of the misunderstandings, CSOs will have to do it themselves. And it may be the case, but that sometimes there's not enough resource. But ultimately, it can be a delegated activity that can be done.
Yeah, okay. And it's important. Yeah, I was going to say it's important as well, as we do a lot of work in practices and PCNs. Some of them are coming from a sort of rather sort of early base on how to do this as well. So the input of a CSO, if you've done this a number of times, that you're going to be involved a great deal. But yeah, you are reviewing it ultimately and sign off.
Okie dokie. So I guess that takes us on to our next question. We kind of started to touch on it, but how do you become a CSO? What is it that you actually have to do in order to start the role?
Actually, I suppose one way of doing this would be, how did I become a CSO? How did you become a CSO, and Dean and everything? And I think we sort of many people will maybe chime with this. I became a CSO back in around about 2012, and I didn't know much about the standards or anything like that, but the company that I was working with at the time had a EHR that needed to connect to the spine for demography, and one of the requirements of that was that you needed to go through this particular process. And so I was leading up, other than the clinical work, I was doing a lot of the clinical governance work in there, and they looked at this and said, Keith, this is something you've always been going on about, wanting to be more involved in technology. Well, here's your perfect chance. Go along and do this. And that's how I came on board. And my training at the time was provided in a course through the NHS. It wasn't the same body as it is now, the one that did the training, but that's how I came into it. What about you, Yusuf?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, and this is coloured by the recent 2 days that we've done the training we've done with Dean, is that having at least some background and doing the clinical risk management sort of process, or coming in with sort of that, and coming in with a scenario that you'd want to work through during your training is really helpful. And I think one of the things that I've talked about why I like Dean's training so much was that everything is grounded in practice. And I think that's for the hardest part that comes from, how you become a CSO. So to answer the question, you need to do a training program, a training course. It can be whatever provider there is out there. We obviously used DPM and Dean for the last 2 days, just as a refresher. But ultimately, whatever course you do, at the other side, you need to practically implement it as soon as possible, or else you will just forget it. And I would say that after you've trained as a CSO, you really should be using it immediately, if not within about 3 months, or else you will just forget.
Yep. And I guess we've had a question come through from Simon P. Whitley. So what system safety engineering experience / qualifications would a CSO have? So I guess it's a similar question to what we've answered, but you both mentioned about courses that you may go on to. Is there a specific one that is seen as, this is the one to do, aside from DPM, because we've already talked about that, that people may want to focus on and things?
Yeah, I'll pick this one up, and in relation to that, and it's a really good question, because if you work in the sort of the safety engineering space, which sort of like that, again, those people that are safety engineers, and I've worked with quite a few of them and know quite a few, worked with the digital clinical safety team at NHS England for a number of years. And a lot of those people come from a technical background in relation, and have worked in other industries. And just to let everybody know, the principles and methodology that are used within the NHS safety standards have come from sort of like, you know, tried and tested methods. They've not just been sort of like picked out of the air and sort of like, we're going to do it this way. It's tried and tested methodology that's been used in other industries. And I would recommend for any CSO, there's no ask for CSOs to have a sort of like system safety engineering sort of like, you know, background in relation to that. But I would advise for all CSOs, because look, we are dealing with in the space within digital health technologies. It's not just the NHS safety standards. There's implications for medical device regulation. Now we're looking at, you know, not just software as a medical device, but AI as a medical device as well. And we're in that space. So I think all clinical safety officers really are obliged to make sure that they are sort of like, there's an ask to make sure that you are current and you are up to speed. And there's lots of courses out there. There's free courses if people go out, and, you know, happy to sort of share some links after this that can be sent out. But there's also paid courses. For instance, you know, through my experience, I've taken postgraduate courses in the practical application of AI at Oxford University. I'm an internal auditor for ISO 13485, which is quality management system for medical devices. So there's lots of strings to our bows in relation to CSOs, but I would advise that CSOs go out there, do a bit of digging, and speak to other clinical safety officers. I think, you know, Keith, we were going to talk about sort of like, you know, forums that are out there. There's many forums now that are growing. You know, we spoke about this yesterday as well. CSOs, if you go back 10 years and, you know, you met another CSO, it was like a big thing, because it was like there wasn't a lot of us around. So, you know, you'd get chatting, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now, if someone says, oh, I'm a clinical safety officer, it's like a bit more sort of like, you know, common ground in relation to that, because we're growing. And the important part is, as Keith said, and Youssef as well, once you've been trained, it's that whole mentorship, making sure you've got, you know, if you can within your organizations, or, you know, get yourself onto a mentorship program, which is something that we do. It's absolutely key, and that you actually start getting under the bonnet.
Awesome. So we're getting some comments and questions coming through. Feel free to add some more if you're watching us live, because we will be showing those in a second. But I guess, Dean, you mentioned a key thing that made me think about this point. Why has the CSO role become so relevant now? Because you've been a CSO for many years. Keith and Youssef have been involved in it for several years as well. But it does seem that in 2025, it just went boom. Why is that?
I can take that one if you like, right?
Yeah.
It was the 9th of June, 2025 that really accelerated everyone's understanding of that. And the reason I mentioned that date is because a letter came out from the CCIO of NHS England, very specifically calling out what you needed to do if you wanted to use an ambient scribe. So ambient scribes are AVT. I'm sure everyone here will know about this as AI gets more widely rolled out. They're transcription and summarization software that people can run to take the cognitive load and the writing load of when you're consulting in a clinical setting. They've been around for a little while now. People like them a great deal. And there was some uncertainty about what was and wasn't required. And the availability of these scribes, it was very, very easy for a person just to start using them. And so there was a wee bit of a Wild West going on. Now, earlier on the year, the NHS has started to put out some guidance, but I think everyone started to get a bit worried. And so on that date, the letter came out and very, very explicitly called out, you need to comply with the DCB standard. You need to have a clinical safety officer. You need to take care of the data protection, the cybersecurity. These devices have to be at least class 1 medical devices. And then there were some other things in there as well. But crucially at the bottom, without doing this, you must immediately cease and desist. The liability will be on yours. And it was pretty sternly worded. There were slightly softer but similar worded letters what came out in Scotland and Wales. And at that point, that I think is when the touch paper was lit and people started going crikey. But CSO was mentioned in there.
Definitely. And I know part of the impact of that was looking around for CSOs to currently do the work. And I guess that also, how does that fit in different situations? And I know, Keith, we talked about this previously in other streams, but I think it's probably useful to cover. Does a practice as an individual need their own CSO, or are there other ways that that can be managed? Because let's not forget, we have practices that are 2,000 patients, which is typically one person shop running. You have practices that are 200,000 patients, which bring additional challenges if you're trying to do that. How does that look?
Yeah, so I can take that. So similar to a data protection officer role, practices don't need to have their own CSO in-house. Okay, they're obviously more than welcome to identify a clinician and train them up and get them going on this technology, but they can also either source it externally or alternatively band together as in a PCN or a federation and appoint appropriate CSO resource. So the specifications, and Dean comment on this, states that top management, whoever that is, has to make sure there is adequate provision and adequate resource for effective discharge of the CSO function. That may be one CSO, it may be a team of CSOs, depends on the tech stack and the tech burden, the compliance burden that practice or group of practices can have. Obviously, if you've never had a CSO before, there's going to be an amount of compliance debt that needs to be paid back. And by compliance debt, I mean the stuff that you're already doing that you don't have the documentation for. So that may be 0160s, it may be requesting 0129s from the manufacturer, implementing that within your existing clinical risk management system, putting in place monitoring processes, incident management plans, effective update and decommissioning pathways as well, or not. So yeah, it's very flexible. All you need to be able to do from a compliance perspective is say, this is our CSO. And that may be a named individual or an organization that does that function for you. But ultimately, it's about doing the process correctly. So, having the right CSO in place is great, but are you as an organization, as a practice, putting in place the things that CSO is recommending that you do? And do you have evidence of actually doing it? So bring your receipts, essentially.
Okay. Interesting points. And I guess the next question I then get often from people when they're looking at that in terms of coverage of practices and that kind of stuff is, how much time do I need as a CSO? Now, I appreciate that question is going to be, again, dependent on what organization you're working with. You said, Yusuf, you said about the tech burden within the practice as well, because that's clearly going to be different if you've got 20 different projects going on compared to one, etc. But any guidance out there for people who are starting the role and thinking, I have no idea how much of this I'm meant to be doing on a regular basis or a project initiation basis? I know it's a slightly long question, but hopefully you get the gist of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can pick that up. So in any digital health project, we know, like with a lot of work you do within project work, that upfront effort is going to be a lot more. So the actual getting compliant with DCB 0129 and DCB 160. So, you've got a lot of safety artifacts, you've got a clinical risk management plan, you've got hazard log, you've got safety case reports, etc. So that compliance pathway is going to be quite intensive in the initial. Yeah. So there are going to be a number of days and there's going to be a lot of effort in relation to get you compliant in relation to that. However, then there is maintenance in relation to that, because just to let everybody know, and I think we're all sort of like allude to this, that this isn't a box ticking exercise where you say I am compliant, fantastic, and then you just move on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
This is for the life cycle of a project, from inception right through to decommissioning or end of life of that product. Therefore, there is a maintenance. The maintaining depends on and is commensurate with the size of the, if it's an EPR, then, and you're getting continuous sort of releases on a regular basis, because obviously we're in the agile, we're not in waterfall anymore, we're in the agile sort of space. Therefore, releases can happen on a regular basis. But I think what Yusuf alluded to, it's making sure that the clinical risk management process is applied effectively, and that will take an amount of time. So ballpark, I don't like doing this and putting days on sort of like, but you're looking in that sort of 15-day effort. I'm talking full 15 days sort of like effort for compliance and to do it properly. And those are people online, please don't shoot me down in relation to that. And then there will be an amount of retention and support that is required to then keep that up to date, so when you get releases, there needs to be an amount of risk assessment that's completed, updates to hazard log, updates to safety case reports, and there's techniques and there's ways that you can do that and use that, and obviously using resources. So it's then that sort of like that maintenance in relation to that. But then obviously in the independent space, it depends how many systems also you're managing as a CSO, and maintaining that work.
Okay. That's really helpful, Dean. But can I ask from the three of you, I'm going to give you a particular scenario because I think this will help to explain it potentially really well to those in general practice about what the role may include. So Keith mentioned obviously that the thing that sparked the CSO kind of population boom was the AVT introduction and NHS England's requirements and stuff that came through that. So if a practice was looking at introducing AVT, they don't have any other specific tools or that kind of stuff, and let's go say a single site 10,000 patient practice, one of the average practices out there and stuff. What kind of time frame are you thinking that they would need in terms of the CSO being involved with that initial exploration, onboarding, and then, like you said, that maintenance for that particular piece of work to introduce an AVT in practice? Who wants to go first? Because I'm going to go to all three of you for your opinions. I would love to have done this simultaneously, but I didn't prepare this in advance. So I'm afraid I can't spring that on you. But yeah, who wants to go first?
I can go first and at least test, so you can at least hear me, because my internet seemed a bit flaky, but you can hear me okay.
Yep,
yes,
you're all good.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so we're going to go well south of those 15 days of labor on that one for an AVT going out. But the reason for that is there's a bit of detail to it. It comes in part because of the fact we're very experienced CSOs, we understand the technology well, and when it comes to AVTs, we've done deployments for very many of them. A lot of the names on the AVT registry right now, which was recently announced, are very familiar to us as well. So there's the familiarity with the manufacturer's case, which is going to be part of what Dean was talking about there, and then there is what needs to be done to establish how governance and everything is done, and the operation within an organization too. That takes a moment to get through as well. The rest of it, when you're deploying an AVT, and if you understand the ambient voice technology well, is mostly about translating that to the context of where you're putting this. And so that takes a period of time. And then you have the hazard workshop, and then the creation of the documentation, and in particular if there's any changes that arise from where it's being used. But end to end, that can be done depending on how quickly things come in. Within the fastest I've seen that done is within about 3 weeks thus far. In terms of the amount of labor within that as well, it's going to be well over up to about 20 hours worth of work in there as well.
Okay.
But that's on something that's highly repeatable. And what I will say here as well is that one of the things that people think about is templates, the idea that you can do this once and then just roll it out elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And I would caution greatly against that. Maybe not surprise you to hear this, given what we do. But when the compliance done on the manufacturer's side, they're saying about their opinion on the safety to proceed if it's used in a certain way in a certain population as it kind of leaves the factory, so to speak. And then it's deployed in a setting. Now, within primary care, there is a lot of similarities, but there's also a great deal of differences as well. And even if you try and assume what some of those are, it's that last mile, it's that last half mile where things are done slightly differently, where everything can start to fall apart. And it is crucial to get that bit right, because clinical safety isn't about the paperwork. Clinical safety is about the process, and the process happens at one point at the start, but then it keeps going. And if you don't get that bit right, it doesn't really matter what the paperwork says. Things are going to go wrong. So that's a bit more lengthy in terms of an absolute number, but that's why when you heard 15 days of labor in there, I came back on it. But it's less, but there's still more to done. I don't know, Yusuf, do you want to chime in on that? And Dean, interested to hear your feedback actually.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go. I think it depends. Okay, it depends. It depends on the maturity of the organization. It depends on the current processes in place. Okay, the clinical safety standards, they're not there as this brand new thing you have to introduce. They essentially, and we talk about this a lot. A CSO's job is kind of a check and balance on everything, because if you do a hazard log properly, what you do is you say, right, is our business continuity plan in place in case this happens? Do we have a data breach policy in case this happens? Do we have a policy to act on user feedback or to act on when patients complain something's gone wrong? So they actually touch every part of what a general practice or a trust should operate. And a good CSO will say, is what we have fit for purpose, yes or no? And this is why it's kind of a multidisciplinary. So we have a concept of clinical safety MDT. Going back to the question at hand, if all those structures exist and are functioning and are effective, the job of a CSO is very easy, because they say, look, here is the new product. These are the risks. This is how it integrates into your existing systems. And then it really just becomes a matter of, do you have these additional bit things that are like, for example, training, monitoring, and putting in the SOPs around that AVT? That could literally take a couple of days with enough input from the team around it. However, if the CSO comes in and says, okay, your current incident management policy won't work for this. You're not meeting regularly enough. You're not auditing this. There is no way for users to feedback. There is no way for updates to be deployed and to be checked before deployment that they're not going to break anything. They need to put that in place. And and going back, and so we have a lot of discussions with GP practices when we say, oh, it's going to take this much and it's going to cost this much. And rightly, they're like, oh, that's a bit too expensive. But we don't know. But the problem there is, and often we get say, oh, we'll train our own CSO. And we're like, great, we support that. We think more CSOs is a great thing. But the same way that you could probably do your own accounts, but you ask for an accountant to do it, is because they can do it much faster and with a much higher degree of accuracy and bringing their expertise and insight. It's the same thing with an experienced CSO. They'll be able to do that job at a much faster pace and give you a much better overall product than taking someone who's just finished their CSO training and putting it through a technology that a basic technology is going to be quite difficult to do anyway. One with AI is going to have even additional risk that unless you understand the technology inherently well and understand the process it's going to be deployed in, is going to be much harder for an inexperienced CSO to do than an experienced one. So my cop out is going to be it depends, but but I agree it can be as few as a couple of days, but it can be much longer than 15 days depending on what structures around it you need to put in as well.
Okay. I would comment it in. I'm not going to cop out saying it depends, because it does depend. You're absolutely right. The couple of days bit, I'm sort of like leaning away from that, because there's lots to be done in relation to, if you think of the responsibilities of a clinical safety officer, especially if we're talking around, well, any system comes with further regulation. If you're in the AVT world, then we've also got to be mindful of, and this is what CSOs need to do their due diligence as well. So, we've just created and piloting 2 courses, AI risk management and AI governance courses. And you've got ISO 42001. For those that don't know what that is, that's AI management system. It's aligned with the quality management system ISOs. Okay. And then you've got British Standard 30440, which is AI validation framework in a healthcare setting. And these are serious standards. They need to be adhered to, even though we don't have any mandated standards within for AI within the UK at the moment. We need to take these seriously. It's not just a matter of doing a hazard log, a safety case report, etc. You need to make sure that you can evidence the governance that's in place. And more so, as Yusuf alluded to as well, lots of these governance documents, these policies, these procedures, these organisational documents, and also Has the organisation got a clinical risk management system? So on and so forth. So there's a lot sitting around the peripheries that maybe more so for an independent CSO, but also this is the responsibility of CSOs within organisations as well, is that they need to be mindful of all these processes. Because if your governance and your structure is broken, trying to implement a sound clinical risk management process into your organisation is a lot harder in relation to that. So I think my sort of 10, 15 days to the marker was in relation to supporting the whole process in relation to not just the production of a hazard log, a safety case report and everything. There is a lot more to the role of a clinical safety officer in relation to that. Hence why we are advocates that I trained 200 CSOs last year, but I asked the question, what next in relation to that? Yeah. So what do you do then? You've been trained, so what now? Yeah. And this is why we're advising, you need mentorship. You need to be applying clinical risk management from the start. This has raised talks about us discussing as a collective yesterday, myself, Keith and Yusuf, around, we've got an AI sandbox, okay? MHRA have that in relation to that. And we're looking at what are the possibilities around the clinical risk management sandbox in relation to utilising that in training, and that people can access after training so that they can run through some real sort of solid test examples to actually put it into practice.
Okay. And I guess with that, then we're getting quite a few questions coming through. So I think probably worth we start having a look at those. The first one I'm going to jump to then, and I think this is probably a really useful one, to be honest. So unfortunately, from a random LinkedIn user, we don't know who, but what lesson did you each learn the hard way from your first time being a CSO?
Yeah, I can pick this one up. So being complacent in relation to what you do, but I think unfortunately that comes with not knowing what you don't know in relation to that. And I don't mention, so I worked for a big EPR supplier as a CSO. That was my first role, and I was responsible for 4 operational CSOs. By the end of that role, I was there for 11 years. But at the start of that journey, no one was listening. Okay, therefore I just trudged on my own. And obviously you make unverified assumptions in relation to the production of your documentation. And if I look back at that now and compare it to what I do now, it's like chalk and cheese in relation to that. So my advice is please for clinical safety officers, it's very positive now because we have lots of forums there and there is a network out there. So please reach out to people. And people are very, very good at giving their time as in relation to that advice and guidance, and that would be one of my advice. And
the hard lessons. I agree with what Dean's saying there. Is that whatever you do, there's always going to be room for improvement. So you're going to have to get used to the fact that you're going to be signing off things that you look at in the light of other things afterwards and going to want to go back to them. Hence the importance of continual improvements and everything. The hard lesson that I learned was that sometimes the amount of pressure you will come under to change your mind about things. Once you've settled on something, and it can be really subtle, and sometimes it can be overt, and sometimes it can be really angry people saying that you're blocking everything, my God, and and all that. Part of the reason I set up Curistica is that that's often a consequence of people paying lip service to clinical risk management. They think that you're just there to just put a rubber stamp on something at the end and soak up all the risk. And of course, that's not the case. If you are doing this right, and I'm talking more on the manufacturer side here, if clinical safety is involved throughout the building of a product, or if you're deploying it and primary care is truly involved in all of this, there should really be no big surprises. And actually the CSO can help steer things into a much more productive, say yes as opposed to a say no way. If you get a poor CSO who's someone 10 minutes before they push the button to release something, say, yeah, it's okay. And you look at it, it's going to be unsurprising that the CSO is going to potentially balk. And the hard lesson I learned is that you can come under a great deal of pressure And, you know, there's times that I've buckled as well within this too. And I'll tell you something, you never feel good about that. So yeah, get in there early. I'd say that was it. I don't know about you, Yusuf.
Yeah, so I think from my experience, there's two ways of doing this. One is the one I like is a play on it is better done than perfect, right? And it's about being pragmatic and practical. There are you know, there's two ways around this. There's people say it has to be perfect. You know, you've got to take all the risks, mitigate them to perfection, all this kind of. That's absolutely not how it works. It is a pragmatic, practical, professional role. You've got to balance competing interests and demands in a way that you deliver something that people are actually going to use. That's fine having a 50-page SOP. If no one's going to look at it, it might as well not exist.
Yeah.
So that's one of the lessons. And the other one is it is not something done in isolation. Okay, you have to absolutely have the right people in the room, or else you're going to make your life a lot harder than it actually is. You know, I think for the first one, I certainly did. I sat there for about 3 days, racking my brains, going, "How does this work? How does that work? How does this work?" But then it all got solved in like a 1 hour hazard workshop kind of thing, where I just asked a question and someone like, "This is how it works." That's it. You know, so it's make sure that what you're doing, whatever you're doing, takes you towards a pragmatic endpoint. Number one. And make sure that you spend time identifying the right people to have in the room and ask questions. It is, you know, to take something from ISO 14971, having the right people in the room and asking the right questions is evidence itself of you doing something properly. You don't have to have a published research article or a study to back up your justification. Just having the right people in the room with the right qualifications and experience is as good of evidence as any.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to go to a couple of other quick questions, and I've got what may be a bit of an interesting one for you that's come through from a completely separate channel. So I think that's going to be an interesting one for you both, for all three of you, sorry. So first from Dr. Kem Gokun, how can one be involved in projects once they become a CSO instead of applying to full-time CSO jobs?
I can maybe come to this as well.
Yeah,
so it all depends on. I missed the name of the person who asked, but whoever was asking that, it kind of all depends. Oh, is it Dr. Gokun? So it kind of all depends a wee bit on what your current role is as well, and whether you're full time in that role or a portfolio or a session or something like that. But how to get more involved in it. So a lot of people will want to explore this and get into it. You know, they aren't being formally asked to do it in the organization they're in, either a practice or a trust or something like that. And then they get the qualification and they're like, well, what's next? So how to get more involved? If you haven't been specifically tasked with the work immediately and you can get cracking, I often recommend that people identify the people in the organization that already do this, and connect with them, observe them, assist with them, and get started that way. If you're in a practice and you've been fired into a CSO role, and but you're struggling with to get started, there are some of the foundations in there establishing the background of how is governance, how is clinical risk managed in the organization as well. Mm-hmm. If you're a total freelancer in this one, if you're like a locum GP or some other thing as well, that can be a wee bit trickier, because one thing that's not going to help you terribly much is just doing a quick sort of parachute in DCB 160 and then zip off again. That's really not going to work. It's not going to work for the people that you're helping out, and it's certainly not going to work for you either. So in those circumstances, it might be worthwhile thinking about this. Again, primary care side of things, there may be we talked a little bit about, does every practice need a CSO? And the answer was no, they need access to a knowledgeable one in there. I'm not suggesting at that point that you should then be a CSO across a bunch of practices because you're sort of fresh out. But there'll be people that are doing this role as well. So we'll be able to sort of come in and assist on that and observe and start taking parts of it. I make same recommendations about getting into product management. You can't just jump straight into it. Find out what you're useful and then begin to observe and assist and go into that. I don't know, Dean, Yusuf, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's like you said, Keith, it's get involved if you can. I know sometimes it's hard within your organisations, but you just got to go out and do some digging, start chatting to people. If you've got an interest in sort of like digital health as well, because I get these phone calls quite a lot where people are saying, I've got an interest in digital health. I really want to get involved. I'm using platforms. I've got lots of questions, and I'm sort of like, I'd want more experience. And say, you need to start speaking to sort of like, some of those roles in relation to sort of like, and seeing if you can be involved in projects, whether it's as a digital champion, or even further involvement in those. And just on that as well, those people that are looking to be trained as a clinical safety officer, I will just give you a bit of advice. If you are not working in digital health at the moment, okay, and you don't have the experience, the danger is if you come onto a clinical safety officer course and you put all of that effort and you put some, you put financially as well some money into that, then you do put all of that effort in, and you are not exposed to, and you are not working in digital health, then you are going to lose all of that training and those skill sets. You're going to lose those, okay? And you're going to need at some point, if you're not coming into it for a 6 month or more period, then you're wasting your time in relation to that. For it to be effective, it's really important that you are working on digital health projects in relation to that.
I think I'd echo that. And I think I'd probably liken that to when you're working in general practice as a clinician, and then, particularly our female colleagues, you go on mat leave and then you suddenly come back to it. It's a completely different world because you haven't used those skills for such a long period. Even though you've got the training, the knowledge, everything, because you've not done it for such a long period of time, it kind of feels like you're coming back to it fresh. And then there's that burden of restarting again, almost in some aspects, particularly with how things may be now different from 9 months, 6 months ago, etc. And I think to Keith's point, one of the ones, if you are a freelancer looking for things, maybe worth looking at PCNs in particular, that may be looking across different practices. So doing it under an umbrella organization, maybe that covers a variety of practices, it may work a little bit better from that perspective. But again, that comes down to individual situations. That's not always going to be the case. I'm going to go next to a question from Daniel Scott. It's a little bit longer, but I think the first part exemplifies the actual question. So in terms of governance, who is responsible for regulating, overseeing, and investigating the work and outputs of the clinical safety officer? So
Nobody.
That's the question. Okay.
No one. This is the problem.
Nobody. So this is a big bugbear of ours, and something that we're looking to try and push forward. But it's really important that, look, there's lots of conversations that are being had at the moment within NHS England and in the independent sector, and we're really trying to push this forward so that we do this collaboratively. It's the only way it's going to work. We've got lots of suggestions, and look, maybe we can afford more time and put more effort into this in the independent sector, which is absolutely fantastic. So we're going to forge ahead in relation to that. So there is no CSO register, okay? Like our PIN numbers for the NMC, for the GMC, etc. There is nothing for CSOs. We would like to see the clinical safety officer recognised as a profession in relation to that, because it is a unique skill set that we have, and also we would like to see it further regulated in relation to that. Now, the difficult part is, how does that happen? Yeah, because it's obviously resource intensive in relation to that. But as a starting point, and just to let people know on here, we have produced an initial paper in a proposal in relation to a national CSO body in whatever way that looks like. But we are going to be discussing that moving forward, and we'd love people's input in relation to that. And also, we are looking at a voluntary register in relation to that as well. And yes, it will be voluntary. But however, we would, like to say to people that for best practice, we need a register, and maybe in some way that once we start that register, that it's the responsibility of those approved trainers. And I'm happy to kick this off because we are we are on an NHS framework, that it's their responsibility to put people initially on that register. Who have they been trained by? What's their professional registration? And importantly, when do they need to do their refresher training, which should be annually in relation to that? And can that person give us any information about their plans are they going to be supported within their organisation around mentorship, etc., in relation to that, and see where it goes.
And that question came from Daniel Scott, didn't it? If I'm right, that's Daniel based up in north of Scotland, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And what's interesting in getting that particular question from Daniel is, of course, that the DCB standard is not actually legally mandated in Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland. I know Scotland and Northern Ireland definitely. I don't know what the situation exactly is in Wales. It's a bit more complex, but it is considered best practice, and very positively, it's been pretty well adopted up in Scotland too. So what's interesting about those nations where it's not currently in place and therefore has all the sort of time taken to put this through, they have the opportunity to actually accelerate some of this as well. So the conversations that we're discussing here about, a national body or a register or anything like that could accelerate in the other home nations.
Okay, so we've got a few more minutes to go. I've got a couple more clarification questions, and then, but before we get to those, I am going to bring on this amazing comment from Liz Price. So thank you for the session.
Liz. Hi, Liz.
Incredibly helpful to hear the practical discussions. As an MDO, we are keen to support members to use technology safely, and I personally think all practice should be encouraged to listen to these types of pragmatic conversations. Just then asking if it's recorded. Yes, it's recorded. It's available on YouTube, LinkedIn, everywhere after this session. Same links that you're probably looking at it now. And if you're not looking at it now, well, I don't know how you're reading this, so that's a bit confusing and a bit meta for me. But yes, it's available afterwards as well for free access. And I know definitely Keith, Dean, Yusuf, they're keen for you to contact them if you've got any questions. Best place to do that for Keith will be Curistica, and for Keith and Yusuf will be curistica.com. And then for Dean will be DPM, which is dpmdigitalhealth.co.uk. Alternately, as ever, they're on the platforms, LinkedIn, etc. and stuff. However, couple more questions if we can. We're going to see if
can I just very, very briefly say, Liz, I also recognize Liz. Liz is at the MDDUS, Medical and Dental Defence Union of Scotland, was my indemnity provider for a while. And it's lovely to have that question, important question. I'm sure everyone in the room is also thinking, what about indemnity? What about liability and how we're covered as well? And I just briefly say on that, it's not entirely clear just now, although there are some solutions out there. I obviously had some conversations with the MDDUS here. We've recently moved over to a provider called Capsule, and I think there may be some other ones out there, but in short, it's not terribly clear right now.
So that's a valid question, and that was going to be my next one. So when the PCN clinical director role came out, nobody knew how that would be covered from an indemnity perspective. So how does that work from a CSO perspective? I know you partly answered that, but I guess any further comments on that, Keith?
Well, I mean, I'll just say within that, when I started out as a CSO, it was held separately. I was an employee, and it was covered under sort of the employer's side of work as well. And I think for many, we were CSO. If you're employed CSO within a manufacturer, for example, that should be covered. But even so, it was always a little bit nebulous. And however, it's generally private providers. I don't know exactly what the position of the MDOs is right now, and maybe they can, I'm sure they're clarifying things here. But we went to a specialist provider on this as well. We're not, there's no clinical contact in this one as well. It's important to say.
I would just advise as well on picking up on that, that individually clinical safety officers, even if you're part of an organisation, okay. I would sort of get advice in relation to sort of your individual indemnity as well, because you wouldn't want to have yourself in a position where your organisation themselves are going to potentially take action against you as a CSO in relation to your sort of your actions. So I would also look at sort of, because that was advice given to me when we went independent. And also when I was working for the EPR supplier, they said totally get yourself indemnified, just to make sure you're fully covered. Okay,
so maybe one for us to find out on, is that kind of covered under medical indemnity, or is that a separate product that people need to consider? And with that, Dean's comments about having a separate one possibly for yourself rather than under your organisational banner, is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, and so just to give you my example, so we had, I have professional and public indemnity in relation to that. Now, the normal, the sort of word on the ground and the advice is that that's in the sort of 2 million mark. However, depending on sort of frameworks, so when we had to apply for certain frameworks, they may stipulate that you have a certain level, which has actually pushed us up to 5 million in relation to that.
Okay, so I said I've got a bit of a curveball question for you, and I think I know where this is going to go, but it's going to be an interesting one, I think. So given the government are absolutely pushing AVT in terms of one of the saviors for the transformation of, healthcare, it's going to save us hours and hours and hours of time. Does that mean it's automatically safe? And I asked that because some of the comments I'm getting are because this has been written into the 10-year plan, the medium-term framework, all that kind of stuff, that actually this is the NHS saying that AVTs should be used, and therefore you don't need to do the clinical safety work because it's, we now have a registered list of approved providers, for example. Thoughts on those perspectives?
Right. Yusuf, so I was going to say, Yusuf most recently said something on this. I'll hand to you.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. Controversially, I think just because the government says something doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be everyone's going to agree with it. I think the AVT registry is a good step in the right direction. I think it clarifies a lot of what people should have been doing. And I know, Dean and I were both written on this and broadly in agreement that it's a good first step. But what I'm very concerned about is it's taken as the only step. And I think that's my fear, is that all it is saying, we have checked and the manufacturer has the documentation, it exists, that complies with the necessary regulations and law. That's all it does. They haven't assessed the quality of this documentation. They haven't assessed how you're going to deploy it. The onus and the liability still sits with the organization taking on that AVT, that technology. And just to point out that only about a quarter of the AVTs we use in the country currently are on that list. That doesn't mean the other ones are unsafe to deploy in any way, shape, or form. It just means that they didn't send the correct documentation to NHS England. They may have it now, they're just not on that list. So I think AVTs are great. I think, the studies have shown that they do improve the quality of life for the clinicians using it. They may not release that clinical time that people think it does, but certainly they do help improve their, reduce the burnout rates, reduce the burden on all of them. I think how they're used, how they're deployed, especially in the context of this ever increasing cognitive burden that digital health technologies have. So one of the interesting things Keith and I were figuring out this last few weeks is how many different toolbars are there for these technologies? You've got a toolbar for your AVT, you've got a toolbar for your, eConsole, you've got a toolbar for AccuRx. They all sit on your screen. How much of the EPR is actually visible at the end of the day? Like that interaction of between the technologies and the human is going to become far more important as we start loading these technologies on top of each other. So this is why, and I'm really pleased to see the Health Services Safety Investigation Bureau kind of pick this up and say we're going to see what this last mile deployment risks are, and they picked it up with EPR recently. And I think that's why it's really important for practice and trust to understand that yes, NHS England has this registry. Yes, they've said these things are verified for use, but you still have to do your due diligence. You still have to do your legwork to make sure that it's safe how you use it in your specific circumstance.
Absolutely agree with that. And I guess the best way I can reflect that to our primary care colleagues, just like when you sign a prescription, it's the person's name who signs the prescription that has authorized it and has the liability when it comes to that prescription. I guess when it comes to deployment of technology, and particularly AVTs, ultimately, it's still the practice and the people using the technology that have the liability and responsibility to make sure it's being used appropriately. And it sounds like some of that's delegated to the CSO to support that process, but it's everybody involved who's using it still at the end of the day.
Can I'll also just say, simple answer is, can AVTs be used safely? The answer I think is yes. If you do all of these things and you use them as intended and you check the outputs, and particularly when you consider it against the alternative, which is maybe you're rushed and not writing things down, the human quality of note keeping and everything is low. This is the other bit, Dean, we were talking about this yesterday, it's risk-benefit analysis as well. These aren't being deployed in a vacuum or into a state of absolute perfection, are they? We have to bear this in mind with a lot of other things. So, of course, they'll be safe if you do this work.
Absolutely. So I'd love to thank everybody who's joined us for this session. We've had some amazing comments. So this one from, again, LinkedIn user, a very practical and grounded session. Really appreciate the wisdom. I suspect I could speak with each of you for a while and still keep learning. If you want to contact them, as we mentioned earlier, you can contact the Curistica team. That's Keith and Yusuf on curistica.com. Alternatively, contact Dean on DPM, which is dpmdigitalhealth.co.uk. Unfortunately, we're run out of time. We've hit the point where we're not going to be able to take any further questions, but the ones that we haven't answered, to be fair, have been covered in this live stream. So if you want, just click rewind. I'll timestamp everything later down the line, and all this will be available for you. And as ever, we'll be here to take and answer your primary care and learning. And we'll catch you next time. See you later.